pretty sure by this point, every Christian, at least in Canada, has heard of James Coates. However, if you're unfamiliar, James Coates is the pastor of Grace Life Church in Edmonton. Due to the COVID-19 restrictions and lockdown, Alberta Health saw fit to limit church capacities to about 15%. However, Coates did not want to limit his congregation size and thus continue opening his church. He was arrested and jailed and pretty much has been in jail since February 16th until recently this week when he was released. Because COVID has become so politicized, fighting has ensued, and it's no different even within the church. People have been arguing whether Coates was right to do this or not, and whether he was honoring the government was okay or not. Was he right? In light of this argument, people have been throwing around different verses, and one of those major verses has been Romans 13. But what does Romans 13 actually say? So if you want to turn there with me, let's read it. Read verses 1 to 7. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For those rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good. And when you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjugation, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. So Paul wrote this letter to create unity within the church. So it's a little bit ironic that this passage has become so disunifying. Paul tried to create unity by addressing that both the Jews and the Gentiles had sinned and were culpable before God. That's Romans 1 to 8. Then he showed that a true Israelite was part of the promise through faith rather than flesh. Therefore, both Jew and Gentile could be part of the promise. Romans 9 to 11. Now that both Jew and Gentile were part of the people of God, both should live like it, living as living sacrifices, as one body in love. Romans 12. Then we arrive at the passage I just read, and Paul then finishes off the chapter by telling the Romans to only owe each other in love through the way they live. In other words, they should have an ethic of love. The very first point in this passage is a very obvious one. The state has an authority that God has established, and therefore we should live our lives in a way that honor the government. Paul makes this very clear as that God has established the government for the purpose of doing good through enforcing the sword. God is a God of order rather than chaos. Right from the beginning, God created a natural order throughout the world. Many people are afraid of this natural order or hate it because it is a natural authority that has been placed over them in the world and that has been established by God. God has placed this order throughout the animal kingdom, through families, the church, and even the state, as we can see in this case. However, we are to go even further than just accepting this authority. We are to honor the government. We are to honor the state. Again, I'm going to read verses 6 and 7. For because of this, you also pay what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. It isn't just about taxes like it is so often brought up with this passage. We also owe honor. When you talk about Prime Minister Trudeau, do you just say, "Oh, I hate that guy"? Or do you say, "No, I think he has destructive policies, and it's not honoring to God, and it's not honoring to fellow Canadians. I hope he changes that"? One of those things is the right we have as Canadian, but the other is the obligation of the follower of Jesus Christ. The state also uses the sword as a means of discipline. God disciplined Israel for their disobedience through Assyria with the sword, and then he disobeyed Assyria with Babylon in the same means, through the sword. However, the sword is also used by the state for individuals. That's why Paul writes, "If you do wrong, be afraid." However, the issue for us arises when the state does evil, or it prohibits us from honoring God, like James Coates would argue. So a parallel passage that's helpful, a parallel passage of Romans 13, 1-7, is 1 Peter 2, 11-17. Again, just like the context of Romans 13, the call of 1 Peter 2 is instructing believers on how to live. So if you turn there with me, we'll read 11-17. Beloved, I urge you, as sojourners and exiles, to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Be subject to the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme or the governor sent by him, to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor. We are to reject evil and honor the emperor, or honor this authority that has been placed over us, because it is the will of God. Therefore, honoring authority goes up to the point of evil. Even Peter, the author of this letter, said in Acts 5:29 to the Sanhedrin, the religious authority above him, in the case when they asked him to stop preaching about Jesus Christ, he said, "We must obey God rather than men." This was a governmental body above Peter. Likewise, Paul trained as a Pharisee, so he would have seen throughout the Old Testament the midwives, they did not obey Pharaoh in killing the baby boys. That saved Moses. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not bow to the idol, as Nebuchadnezzar, their king, had commanded. Rahab did not reveal the spies to the king of Jericho, and Daniel disobeyed Darius, his king, with the law that said he had to pray to Darius. And Esther, she broke Persian law by approaching the king to speak on behalf to save the Jews. So clearly there's some form of tension here. On one hand, we see there is an obligation to obey authority. that God has instituted because it's for our own good. It's displaying the order God has created in the world. It brings justice, and it serves as an instrument for God's purposes. While on the other hand, there are examples riddled throughout the Old and New Testament of men and women trying to put God before the law. To make things even more complicated, the COVID-19 lockdowns and restrictions have made things less clear. Some say we're not loving our neighbors because we're putting their health at risk, while others say, no, if we don't meet, we're just sweeping their spiritual health off to the side, and that's just as important. Obviously, we want to be good stewards of what God has given us, including our health and the people around us. The elderly are more at risk, and those with conditions are vulnerable too. In the case of congregations such as the one my mom is a part of, the median age is probably 70 or 75. It's a very old church. So in a case like this, it makes sense to wait to meet as brothers and sisters in the Lord again, or even to meet in smaller groups. However, the majority of us are healthy and under 65. Remember, the command is instructed to honor the governing authorities. But the context of this passage is surrounded by loving people, loving one another, and being unified as the church. While these two things may seem to contrast or even be paradoxical, I think honoring the government and obeying God are not contradictory in our context. The context does not say to do everything the government commands, but to submit and honor authorities, which includes the government. Combining these two parts of the argument, I believe Christians should continue to meet as believers. However, I'm going to highlight again 1 Peter 2:15 and 16. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. When we meet, we should be extra strict with our own standards. We should be putting on masks. We should be spacing out. We should be overzealous to honor the government. Our opinions on how effective masks are completely irrelevant for this conversation because our duty is to honor the government's authority. If they asked us to wear socks and sandals, as useless as that would be to reduce the spread of COVID-19, it shouldn't matter. We should follow suit because it would be honoring to them. Additionally, we should be setting an example by meeting in private homes and keeping the commandment rather than publicly doing so and publicly broadcasting like we would in church buildings. So to answer the question I raised at the beginning, was James Coate in the wrong for meeting with his congregation? I don't think he was. But at the same time, I think he was wrong for publicly meeting and defying the government, thus not honoring them. The purpose of the church isn't to hear a sermon. That's not why we meet. It's bigger than that. We didn't think of the church like that before COVID, and we shouldn't start thinking of it like that now. Meeting as the body is for serving one another. Meeting as the body is for corporate worship and partaking in the sacraments, as well as hearing the preaching of the word. If you're still struggling with this and the different views, I'd encourage you to continue and read on in Romans to chapter 14. It will be helpful, though convicting. Remember, we are to act in love and unity, honoring of our government, whom God has instituted. I will make one thing absolutely clear. This is not about our freedoms or our liberties. We can throw those aside. It is about honoring authority and obeying Christ. So please, put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Father, I want to thank you for the unity of your word. Thank you that you have called us to be unified in the church to reflect this. Lord, I thank you that you have given us the ability to love one another and those we disagree with. God, I pray this time would be a time of unifying the church and strengthening the church. Ultimately, Lord, I pray your will be done. I pray this in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.